Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Russian Revolution area of study 2. In this video I'm going to look at the introduction of state capitalism by Lenin and the Bolsheviks in April 1918. It was a pragmatic act of Lenin because it was primarily motivated by Lenin's desire to keep the Bolsheviks in power. When the Bolsheviks did come into power in late October 1917, they gained power far sooner than they expected to. As a consequence, they didn't have much of a plan about how to turn Russia's semi-capitalist feudal economy into a socialist one. So many of their early policies were passed in order to appease and retain control of some of the key power groups, particularly, for example, the peasants. So the peasants had, since going right back to February 1917, been seizing land. This continued through from February 1917 right up until October 1917. And Lenin recognised that he needed to retain the power of the peasants and the support of the peasants. So he pretty much approved these land seizures by the passing of the Decree on Land, which he passed in November 1917. The other key group that he wanted to retain control of was obviously the workers, who the Bolsheviks had conducted the revolution on behalf of. The workers weren't seizing land, but they were seizing factories, and the worker movement, which was much of it was independent of the Bolsheviks itself, was very, very powerful. In late October, early November 1917, Lenin felt that he did not, and the Bolsheviks did not have the power to try to overthrow this worker movement or gain control of it. So instead, he decided to appease it. And he did this by introducing the Decree on Workers' Control in November 1917, which recognised the workers' takeover of the factories. And you can see there, Lenin was not willing to fight the powerful workers' movement, which had seized the factories and formed workers' committees at this time. And he needed to support both of the workers and the peasants to fight the civil war as well against the whites. A key body that Lenin and the Bolsheviks set up at this time, however, was Vyshenka, and Vyshenka was the Supreme Council of the National Economy. It was formed in December 1917, and its role was to oversee the economy. It would play a key role in state capitalism. So by April 1918, Lenin believed that the Bolsheviks had enough authority to try to rein in and take control over this independent workers' movement. And he was going to do this by introducing state capitalism. Some key aspects of state capitalism would be that he would impose labour discipline upon the workers, make them work harder in order to raise productivity, industrial productivity, and improve the economy. He aimed to do this by, firstly, keeping the bourgeois managers in their positions of power within factories, because they are the ones who had the knowledge how to manage workers and how to run these factories efficiently. And he would do this by paying the bourgeois managers higher wages. Another aspect of state capitalism was that in the short term, the state would control some large industries such as banks and weapons factories, as well as trade with foreign countries, but the Bolsheviks would not nationalise all businesses. Most businesses would stay privately owned, and that economic body that we spoke about before, Vyshenka, which was set up in December 1917, would facilitate this. And Lenin argued, that this policy of state capitalism was to be a temporary compromise measure. He was fully aware that many Bolsheviks, many communists were not happy with this policy of state capitalism because it was not a communist economic policy. It was a capitalist economic policy. And I've got a quote here from Lenin which outlines his view of why it was necessary to introduce state capitalism at this time. And he said, "For the present, we shall have to adopt the old bourgeois method and agree to pay very high salaries for the services of the biggest bourgeois specialists. All who are familiar with the situation see the necessity of such a measure, though not all understand its significance for the proletarian state. Clearly, it is a compromise measure, a departure from the Paris Commune. There were many groups who were not happy with the introduction of state capitalism, both within the Bolshevik movement and outside of the Bolshevik movement. Some of these groups criticised this policy for a number of its aspects. The left communists, for example, feared that state capitalism would lead to the formation of large companies controlled by capitalists, thus empowering the capitalist class. So, making these companies that already existed in Russia into even bigger ones and empowering the capitalists. They also feared that authority within the party, the Bolshevik Party, would become more centralized and bureaucratic and take power and independence away from the local Soviets. Furthermore, they feared that the imposition of a stricter labour policy upon workers would undermine working conditions. So when we're talking about a stricter labour policy, we're talking about longer hours of work for pretty much the same pay. And here are an overview of their criticisms here. And this quote I've taken from a series of left communist objections to Lenin's policy, which they made at the Bolshevik conference on the 4th of April 1918 in response to Lenin's introduction of state capitalism. Instead of leading from partial nationalisation to complete socialisation of large-scale industry, agreements with captains of industry would lead to the formation of large trusts controlled by the latter and embracing all basic branches of industry. The trusts, to be sure, would be given the appearance of government undertakings. Government would have to become more bureaucratic and centralised, and individual commissars more dominant. Local Soviets would have to be deprived of their independence. So it's interesting when they're highlighting their fear that the government would have to become more bureaucratic and centralised. The creation of a bureaucracy, almost a corrupt bureaucracy, which would then would impact upon the success of the revolution. The left communists were not the only ones to criticise Lenin for introducing state capitalism. Other socialists also criticised Lenin. They argued that by adopting state capitalism, Lenin was actually returning to Marxism, to this theory that it was necessary to pass through the capitalist stage in society in order to reach the socialist or communist stage in society. Prior to October 1917, Lenin had argued, if we remember back, that this was not necessary. He'd argued with his theory of telescope revolution that it was actually possible to, for a feudal society, to skip the capitalist stage and go straight to the socialist stage. However, by introducing state capitalism, he was implicitly arguing pretty much, or believing that it was necessary for Russia to pass through the capitalist stage to get to socialism. The SR Stalinsky argued, in repudiating their own program, the Bolsheviks repudiate the things that distinguished them from other parties. They cease to be Bolsheviks in the real sense of the word. They simply turn into a party that wants to stay in power at any cost. And certainly that is what Lenin did, and that is one of the reasons why he introduced the pragmatic economic policy of state capitalism. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of historical interpretations now about state capitalism. The first one is from Orlando Figes, and he writes, by April 1918, Lenin had come around to the view that industry had to be brought under state control, as opposed to workers' control through collegial boards, with a traditional management structure, one-man management, capable of restoring labour discipline. Lenin demanded that the working class offensive against the capitalist industrial system should be halted in the broader interests of economic reconstruction. The expertise of the bourgeois managers had to be tapped in the interests of the state. This, he admitted, meant using capitalist methods to construct the socialist order. It would be necessary to pay the bourgeois managers a high salary, even though this went against the egalitarian principles of the left. But he argued, since the working class had not yet been trained for the tasks of management, this was a tribute that had to be paid. The ideals of equality had to be sacrificed in the interests of efficiency. And there's the key part of the historical interpretation there from Fige. Our second historical interpretation is from Richard Pipes, and he writes, the Bolshevik Party in 1917-18 was much too small to cope with this task of administering the country and nationalising the economy. In any event, very few of its adherents, most of them lifelong professional revolutionaries, had experience in administration. The Bolsheviks had no choice, therefore, but to rely on the old bureaucratic apparatus and other bourgeois specialists, and rather than administer directly, control the administrators. So, there is our video on the introduction of state capitalism into Russia in April 1918 by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. I hope you find it useful for your study of the Russian Revolution Area Study 2, and I shall see you next time. Goodbye.